Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the Sirius Report. My name is Ken Shorgen, and I'm here with London Paul. And Paul, what's going on in the EU reminds me of a 19th century literature. It was the best of times. It was the worst of times. The EU is dying, and we'll go on from there. Anyway, Paul, I want to thank you as always for being a part of this great discussion. And despite the fact that that was an ominous warning that I gave, it is the very same thing that Macron said recently.
Yeah, well, obviously, thank you as well for joining me. It's a pleasure as always when we get together. But yeah, the European Union has been a very peculiar. Uh, I'm not sure what you would call it. Construct, I think is the best word. It was clearly a US construct, and it's worth mentioning this very briefly. Is it came out of the fact that when the Cold War ended and East Germany and West Germany wanted unification, the United States was fearful of this. They were fearful that that enlarged and Germany could rotate east and form an alliance with the Russians. And, then the whole sort of future of NATO, etc., was then in serious doubt. So the agreement that was reached with the Americans is, well, if we have your unification, you can have it on the grounds that you'll ultimately have to give up the Deutschmark for a currency that then the European Union, as it became, will have to adopt. And basically, it was to try and dilute Germany's power, although it's the biggest nation economically in Europe and the strongest nation financially, etc. It was just to try and dilute that power. And that was the birth of the European Union. It was a complete disaster from day one because you can't marry up the economies of Germany and the PIGS nations, Portugal, Italy, Greece, Spain, and expect it to work, because the euro was always going to be too weak for Germany, too strong for the southern nations. But it's ironic that, as a small side note, that we're starting to find some of the PIGS nations are actually faring better now than Germany, France, and Italy, which are in serious economic financial difficulties. So, setting aside that little brief introduction, the point was statements attributed to Macron. Now, Macron, as we know, and you've made this point before, Ken, politically is in a huge mess in his own country. He's not really wanted anymore. He's kind of hanging on because he can do, and there's a government that people didn't vote for. But in a broader context, I don't know whether this is a reflection of the fact of the fallout of the Ukraine war, which is partly to do with it. It's also just how the European Union's falling apart, and the European Union is increasingly being exposed to be a vassal state, certainly from Brussels' perspective of the US, which it always has been. But Macron came out and made this point. The European Union could be killed by the rise of what he termed the new multipolar world order. So he was speaking at this event in Berlin, actually yesterday, on October the 2nd. And he said he called about this rampant overregulation of the bloc's single market, warning if the union continued down its path, it risked destruction. He claims at the hands of the US and China. I don't quite know how he understands that to be the case. I mean, it's been torn apart by policy decisions inside Europe. But anyway, we're merely quoting him. He then said the EU could die, warning the world's largest trade blocs were ignoring international rules in favor of protecting and promoting their own economies. Well, he's particularly talking with respect to the United States. I think he's just lobbing China in with that argument because he doesn't want to be seen to completely be attacking just the United States. But he says if we don't have a level playing field, we'll be killed in this market. He said our former model is over. We are over-regulating and under-investing. And in the 2 or 3 years to come, if we follow our agenda, we'll be out of the market. I have no doubt. And he talks about industries relocating. He uses the example of the chemical industry in Europe relocating to the US due to the Inflation Reduction Act, which basically gave subsidies And, the US talks about playing on a level playing field. It doesn't care who it stomps all over in the process, including European companies. And Macron says, look, it'll be the same for steel and all existing businesses. He says we have he actually mentions energy costs, but doesn't admit to the fact it's a lack of cheap Russian energy. And he said an overregulation. Well, part of the energy cost problem is they import it from the United States and it's ridiculously expensive. And because the US just doesn't care what it does to its apparent allies. So he said, look, in order to survive, we have to reform, saying the EU should consider ignoring international trade rules where appropriate, and that the EU further integrated the markets of its 27 member states to remain competitive internationally. This is an idiotic suggestion. I mean, further integration is going to cause more disruption, destruction. With regards to the EU model having to be reformed, he's absolutely right. And I think this in part was that Draghi report who basically trashed the existing EU model and said pretty much the same thing, that, there's overregulation, a lack of investment, and if we don't change, we're going to have serious problems. He also warned what he called the EU's over-reliance on the US, saying that whatever the results of the elections in November, the country's interests were moving elsewhere. Well, yes, but the problem is it'll be even worse in one respect if Trump is elected, because Trump might well just say, well, NATO can't exist in the current form. Either we're going to leave NATO or we're going to radically reform it. By the way, we're going to make friends with or try to make friends with the Russians. Okay, he'll want to potentially severely impact the relations with the Chinese, and the Europeans want the exact opposite. So it's a very complicated problem, but he's absolutely right, Macron. Europe is no more the top priority of the US. The US top priority is the US. Well, it always was. It's incredible how these European countries have singularly failed to see this. He thinks that the second top priority is China, and for the rest, it depends on the moment. Maybe we're important if they want us to support the war in Ukraine, but apart from that, they're not interested. So what's the reality that's playing out here? And I think we'll come on to that shortly, because obviously we'll get your thoughts so far on what Macron said.
Yeah, to me, one of the more important things is taking a look at the fact that Europe doesn't invent anything anymore. They might have some chemical industry, they might have some automobile industry. They have nothing to compete with what's coming out of the US. And even the US is declining in innovation and in industry. So now you've got to try to take an overregulated, hegemonic continent that doesn't want to be an equal among equals when it comes to trade partnerships. And instead, the reality is they're going to have to either open the doors for West Asia, especially China, to invest in Europe and have control of a lot of European assets for them to grow and move forward. Otherwise, they're going to become their stagnation that they've done over the past, probably since 1999, for the most part. That stagnation is going to absolutely, what Macron says, it's going to kill the EU. It's going to create balkanization on the continent, where some countries like, say, Hungary are more than willing to create partnerships with China, while countries like the UK, France, maybe Spain don't want anything to do with it, but also don't want to be under the control and the thumb of the United States anymore.
Well, yeah, it's a huge problem. But actually, the UK is talking about turning its relationship round with China and realizing the last few years' policy initiatives have been disastrous. So, again, in a world of rapid change, you can see some incredible developments. But Europe is, it's reached a point where, Germany's rested on its laurels for far too long. It hasn't evolved. It hasn't, grabbed the technological revolution. It now doesn't have cheap Russian energy, so it has problems. So companies like VW actually are now going, well, we're going to have to open and extend the marketplace in China and where they can do business and succeed. But this is moving their operations increasing out of Europe, which creates unemployment problems. And again, it's part of that deindustrialization. But the fact Macron thinks it could be killed by the rise of multipolar world basically is saying, well, the multipolar world is going to be able to do everything we can't do in the future, meaning it will be economically successful, financially successful, societally be successful. It has grown populations. It's where the vertical growth sectors are in the future. And this is everything we are no longer the case in Europe. And for them to be able to make the changes isn't just a question of a realization that Europe has to become more dependent on itself, but where's it going to get resources from? Where is it going to be able to stimulate those technological developments in European countries? These things don't happen overnight, even if you have initiatives, but it's very clear now because of the fact, and it's incredible it's taken them this long to realize this, that China can produce goods, as can other multipolar world, global South countries, much cheaper. And they should have realized this when they were getting cheap Chinese goods for the last 20 odd years. Doesn't seem to have registered with people in the West, but I think it's just this fear and recognition that we're losing across the board. We're losing not just to the global South countries and this rapidly developing multipolar world, but also losing in the process because how the United States has abused its relationship with us. Well, you know, it's incredible. Equally, it's taken them this long to realize this. But I think it's the situation where the Ukraine war has highlighted privately many things for a whole host of European nations, not least that the United States expected Europe to effectively bankroll as well the Ukraine war. But also, you know, they had to just suck up the destruction of Nord Stream and pretend we don't know who did it, etc., etc. And it's caused this rift to start to develop between the United States and Europe. And also there's an understanding, because there's certainly been disagreements amongst the hierarchy in Brussels, because there are some who are very pro or, you know, United States, the Atlanticists, but there are elements who aren't, and they've been at serious loggerheads with each other privately inside the European Union for the last few years. So there's all these problems that are all coming together at the same time. And then I think there is a recognition on some level that the fallout of the Ukraine war is going to be enormous. And, you know, not least the fact that the multipolar world has benefited from the whole Ukraine war, because China's changing its markets. Russia has basically cut off from the West because the West cut itself off, and has adopted new markets in terms of energy and other, you know, critical resources. So, and China has been hugely supportive of Russia. So the argument from the West perspective is they'd strengthen that alliance. And in some senses that's happened, even though the alliance was very strong anyway. So there's all these developments going on, and the French and other countries are looking at this going, well, we're not part of this. And they can't be part of it, because when you're in the NATO camp, when you're in the US camp, you're either with us or against us, and they're not allowed to disagree politically. But I think you're increasingly also going to see these kind of noises, because people like Macron are realizing that politically what's going on in his country and other countries means that these other so-called fringe parties, populist parties, whatever you want to call them, are going to increasingly get more of a lion's share of power, because they're saying the things the people want to hear. So this is as much, I think, a reflection on Macron's own position politically, and But some of the points he makes are true. But the idea he thinks that the United States is going to want a level playing field with Europe is ridiculous. They've used the Ukraine war to exploit Europe and to be able to sell energy to them at whatever price they decide. There's very little negotiation because Europe's desperate for that energy. So it comes back full circle to, is Europe ever going to get cheap Russian energy again? Is it ever going to have access to cheap Russian resources? Is it going to have access to Chinese capital to rebuild the country? Is it going to accept Chinese companies coming into Europe? Because at least they'll employ people. And the list goes on. And until they are prepared to accept that, Europe is just going to continue to disintegrate very rapidly. And ironically, as Europe disintegrates, it now increasingly appears, which is quite surprising in some ways, that the countries in the south, the Greeces, the Spains, and Portugal may actually end up benefiting in a radically reformed world, European Union that changes according to a necessity in the future, and therefore they are likely to benefit more. Okay, there's European countries in the east like Hungary, Slovakia, etc. I think will benefit enormously as well. But ultimately, the argument is, can the European Union can it survive in it really, unless it absolutely radically reforms in ways that are totally unpalatable as things stand, then the European Union can't survive. But it might just be that as the United States has to reflect on its own internal problems, of which they're enormous, not just now, but in the future, there may be the time when they go, well, Europe's no benefit to us, and they just let it go. And then Europe will do what's best for Europe, and then a European Union radically reformed might be in a position to succeed.
Back in 1999, one of the original architects of the euro currency knew that it had flaws. And while he wasn't able to foresee everything that would happen, it was just 9 years later in 2008 that the fallout of having a centralized financial system and financial platform with a singular currency was going to be destructive to not just Europe, but to any of the trade partners that actually relied upon the euro. Now we fast forward to what's going on in the BRICS. And I think, honestly, there is something that is being forged now. And, for out there in the ether, there's a lot of talk about a gold-backed BRICS currency and this type of BRICS currency and that. But there was a paper that was done, I think, given by Rybakov as we head into the Kazan summit, BRICS summit. And he said that this specifically, the BRICS should not create a financial and monetary alliance like the EU did. They should create payment and settlement systems that do not depend upon the old rules-based international order. Now, to distill that, it's creating a platform for nations to do their bilateral trade with one another, but not have a centralized, focused, you have to buy this currency to then trade with this country and then back and forth, sort of like we've done with SWIFT, sort of like they've done with the Euro system. And if this comes to pass and shows the potential of multipolarity in a global platform, then that might be something for the EU itself to change. Because what did we discover when we integrated to a singular currency within the EU? Well, the powerful industrial countries like Germany, France, and formerly the UK, they dominated everybody in Europe. Spain, Greece, Italy, they were all the redheaded stepchildren that had really no say in the matter, had to deal with the monetary policies coming out of the ECB. And of course, really, they were just a bunch, they were, I don't want to use the term raped, but they were pillaged for their resources and their labor to satisfy the bigger, more industrial countries. With this being said, I'm sure that China and India and a lot of the other countries in the global south have seen what a centralized currency does to a system or region or a partnership, and that's something they want to avoid. So instead, create the platform for trade rather than forcing everybody into a centralized currency.
Yeah, absolutely. And he makes the point, the creation of a BRICS SWIFT, not a BRICS Bretton Woods. And that's a huge distinction. So, yeah, it appears based on mutterings and statements coming out from Russia's perspective. Okay, it's just Russia. So is this Russia's perspective, or are they speaking on behalf of the nations? But anyway, they're basically saying the BRICS will work towards setting up an independent payment system based on digital currencies and the blockchain. And this comment came from a Kremlin advisor, Osakov, who said, state-of-the-art tools such as digital technologies and blockchain will be utilized. The main thing is to make sure it is convenient for government and businesses, as well as being cost-effective and free of politics. And he said, he did not mention it explicitly. He says, but a new alternative system already exists for the moment. It is a closely, carefully guarded project in the form of a detailed white paper that has already been validated academically and also incorporates answers to possible frequently asked questions. Okay, difficult to know precisely what that means. And as ever, with all these situations, I've heard various people say various things, even within Russia. So, but I think fundamentally that is a sensible basis to have this payments and settlement system that is an alternative to SWIFT. And of course, it's things like this that starts to deeply unnerve nations in the West, including probably the French and Macron. And it's worth tying these together because this is a serious challenge as part of the multipolar world to unipolarity, to SWIFT, to the idea that basically the world predominantly had to transact in the dollar. Okay, for the European Union, it was different because with each other they transacted in the euro. Absolutely, that was the case. I know some people have at times thought that wasn't the case, but I can assure you it absolutely is and remains so to this day. But I think it's an important development. We've not got long till this meeting happens in Kazan. Another point, just briefly, there's supposed to be, or claims there's going to be up to 10 additional countries announced joining BRICS. There's a lot of applications in various stages of process. I think up to 34 nations have applied now. I mean, but I do think this is certainly working on a replacement for the global South countries, because anybody in future can join BRICS and utilize this. Okay, the nuts and bolts of how this works remains to be seen, and that's the important part. I think, and it's a point I made to Ken before we came on, a lot of appeal about BRICS has gone because there's a lot of people talking about it who didn't know what they were talking about, making up stories. And when things didn't happen, people got bored and went, well, this is obviously not going to happen. This is just people making up stories. But it very much is part of a far bigger change that's going to happen in the multipolar world in terms of how the financial structure, so these building blocks are in place. I mean, there's certainly projects that the Russians are working on now, whether that's something that will apply domestically or how they can domestically integrate that with other BRICS countries or not necessarily even BRICS countries. So I think you can expect a lot of different announcements coming out. But the point that Ken made originally with this is very important. It's very different. And you're absolutely spot on. The European Union could look at this in the future and go, well, maybe this is a better way of doing this. We need to return to our old currencies. Okay, that might, or maybe some combination of it and work on that basis instead. But the West being the West, it's debatable whether that will ever come to fruition. And what happens to the European Union is it'll stagger on until it just dies in totality, and then who knows what comes out the back end of it. But it needs to be more proactive. And if Macron's serious about wanting radical reforms, then this is one thing they need to look at. And, then just for argument's sake, there could be a tie-up between a BRICS currency and a future EU currency. Just as one example, and how, excuse me, the EU can then integrate more into the multipolar world.
Yeah, exactly. And you take a look at the US dollar in itself as a trade currency is not the most important thing to the US power. It's the fact that nations have to hold reserves in the dollar, mostly treasuries, which then funds the US empire, the economy, the empire, everything. Well, as the multipolar world shifts to a bilateral trade scenario, using platforms like the blockchain or whatever system, the alternative Swiss system, then the holding euros and holding dollars becomes less and less of a thing. And it devalues that currency. It's a matter of, yes, say India will trade with the US in dollars, and they'll trade in Europe with euros. But they're not going to be, that's not going to be their primary trade partners. So they're not going to hold as much reserves. They're not going to take those then euros and treasuries and go back and invest in Europe, invest in the United States to build up their economies. No, that's not going to go, that's going to go by the wayside. So Europe has to find a way to invest within itself. US has to find a way to invest within itself. The multipolar world is already working towards investing in their partnerships, whether it's BRICS, ASEAN, SCO, Eurasian Economic Union, and they're not relying upon the old controllers, i.e. the SWIFT and dollar system, i.e. you use the euro within our system or else type thing. It's going to be a multipolar society. And does Europe do the same thing first continentally, where you can go back to trading lira and marks and French francs and Swiss francs and going back to there, but have a more stabilized trading system, platform? Or is it going to be more of a dominance type thing that we saw both leading up to Bretton Woods and then from Bretton Woods to the current? That's going to be the real question. And I think to be able to integrate and improve, because something you said, China, Russia, India, all those multipolar world countries, they want Europe, they want the US to be on board and be good trading partners, but they want them to be equals amongst equals, not dominance amongst sycophants. So that's something to look forward to. But nonetheless, the important thing is that the BRICS and the other multipolar world regions and institutions are moving forward with or without Europe and the US. And very quickly, the US and Europe are going to find themselves behind the power curve already at a time when they're financially bankrupt and they're economically destitute.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's probably a good point to finish on.
Very good. Paul, I want to thank you as always for being a part of this great discussion.
And likewise.
And to everybody here, thank you for being a part of the Sirius Report community. Don't forget to subscribe, like, share, comment, send out to anybody you think would be importance. And until the next time we get together, have a great day.